Russians, stacking dolls, an elaborate drop-down menu, a plate of spaghetti noodles. The Buddha's teaching can be bewilderingly complex. Well, reality's complex, so we shouldn't be surprised. But what if there was a single unifying thread? I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. I had an aha moment. As I've been preparing for this episode, digging into past materials and exploring conversations in an online community of Buddhist practitioners and teachers, and as I continue my own daily practices, I had a bit of a revelation. And it won't be anything really new to anyone who's been studying and practicing the Buddha's Dhamma seriously for any length of time. To be honest, it wasn't entirely new to me either. It was more like the experience of sort of tilting a picture and suddenly seeing it in a way that you hadn't before. The aha moment for me had to do with an insight into the, at times, bewildering array of things in what I might call the drop-down menus of the elements of the Buddha's path, by which I mean, for example, just click on Buddha. Let's say, imagine that on your screen, and one box there is going to be Dhamma, or teaching. And then you click that, and there's going to be the Four Noble Truths, and another box, the Eightfold Path. And then say, click on the Four Noble Truths, and there's going to be four boxes, one for each of the Four Noble Truths. And if you click on the fourth of those, it's going to drop down into the box of the Eightfold Path. And if you click on the first box of the Eightfold Path, that opens back up into the Four Noble Truths, and so on and so on. As you continue opening new layers of the menu, there'll be tabs for things like the 3 poisons and the 6 sense doors and the 5 hindrances and the 7 awakening factors and the different types of right speech and 4 Brahma-viharas and et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you open the tab for the subject of this episode, right concentration, the 8th of the elements of the Eightfold Path, there's also 4 more boxes, 4 states of concentration, and each of those opens to more tabs as well. And as I've said, that can be very bewildering. It's like a spiral of interconnected wires and threads, or a plate of noodles. But that's not my aha moment, because seeing that bewildering spiral is actually nothing new. We've been observing this all along throughout the Buddha episodes. So my revelation? It came from continuing to reflect on and meditate in keeping with the Mahayana Buddhist approach to the cultivation of an all-encompassing compassion as the altruistic aim of pursuing enlightenment. Altruistic because in this way of seeing things, we don't only pursue enlightenment and freedom from craving and the end of suffering for ourselves and our own enlightenment and our own awakening, but for the good of all things and all beings. The cultivation of compassion for all things is the energizing and unifying ground around which the whole edifice of the Dhamma is built in this point of view, from which every practice flows. Or maybe I could put it like this. On the one hand, we can approach the whole schematic of the Buddha's Dhamma as the path that leads to this unifying core of all-encompassing compassion, and that's true. But on the other hand, it's also possible to see it the other way around. Cultivating compassion will lead us to observe the different layers and intricacies within the subtle and deeply ingrained obstacles and hindrances and resistances to true compassion that's buried inside of us. The cultivation of compassion seen like this becomes the single, simple, but not easy, unifying frame of reference and starting point for every point of entry into the Eightfold Path, and it also becomes the ultimate destination of that path. So back to my analogy of the drop-down menus. Compassion is like the cursor, maybe, that we use to hover over every drop-down box that I've mentioned. And the practice of compassion, as we grow in that, is what the finger that clicks the various boxes uses to open them. It's as simple as that, or it's as complex and detailed as that. And now the cursor is hovering right over this final box, well, not final box, but the final box on the drop-down menu of the Eightfold Path. It's hovering over the eighth element in that path, right concentration. Now, concentration is the common English rendering of a Pali word, samadhi. And in the online community of Buddhist teachers and practitioners that I mentioned, that I've been taking part in fairly recently, I saw it described like this. Samadhi means to bring together and to unify, and it can mean to bring to completion. And both senses of the term might fit how it's being used in the Eightfold Path, as unifying the mind and as bringing to completion the Dhamma, at least as that is outlined in the eight elements. One of the examples of samadhi in the Buddhist material is that of a cat hunting a mouse. So imagine that in your mind. We can feel the cat's mind and attention unified in a singular focus on that mouse. That's an example intended to sort of give us a feeling for the first use of the word samadhi, unifying the mind. The second aspect of the meaning of samadhi as bringing something to completion implies that this eighth element of the path is what completes the path. But not just because it's number 8 in the Eightfold Path. It's not just the last item on the list to be checked, to be completed. Samadhi as completion in reference to the path means that it is the exercise of concentration, rightly understood, right conversation, that pulls all the various elements together. It's the thing that brings everything into alignment. Of course, this doesn't have to be a matter of either or. I'm convinced both senses of samadhi apply, but let's open the box and see what's inside it. So here's first the Buddha's description of samadhi or concentration, as that's found in a sutta called Discernment of the Noble Truths. Here's the Buddha, quote, "And what, venerable friends, is right concentration? When the noble disciple is mindful of suffering as suffering, of its arising as its arising, of its cessation as its cessation, and mindful of the path as the path, or when the disciple contemplates his former actions, or when he trains to be mindful of all formations, when he sees the tranquility and calm of nirvana, when he's free from attachment, mindfully contemplates the mind as free, whatever therein is the mind's stability, it's being established in the absorptions, established accordingly, being unwavering and not scattered, being focused, stilled, and rightly concentrated, this is called right concentration." Wow, that's a lot. But to get at this, notice first the references to various other elements in the path, topics we've explored in prior episodes. The Buddha is, in a sense, summarizing the whole path as he describes right concentration. And he talks about it as a concentration in which the mind is not scattered, focused, stilled. It's not scattered, but it is focused and stilled. I don't want to misconstrue how he put that. In other words, it's unified. Here in one place in the Buddhist teaching, we find the emphasis on samadhi as both the unification of the mind in that closing comment and as the unification of the path, the completion of it, bringing the path together, all the ingredients of it as a culmination. And so he talks about things like the noble truth of suffering and of cessation, and he talks about former actions and mindfulness of mental formations. All of these are things that we've looked at in prior episodes, and he's including them here under the banner of right concentration. He goes on to say, that right concentration has 4 layers or dimensions. Now, he doesn't mention there's 4 in the sutta that we just referenced, but he does refer to absorptions, jhana in the Pali. The Buddha doesn't explain those 4 in detail or describe what he means by absorption in the sutta that we just began with. His more detailed description is found in the sutta that we've been looking at in the last 2 episodes as we've explored right effort and right meditation, the sutta called the Discourse on the Analysis of the Truth. So let's look at what he has to say about absorption, concentration in that sutta. And again, I'm going to start by quoting the Buddha. The Buddha said, quote, "What is right concentration? In right concentration, a monk is aloof from sense desires, aloof from unwholesome thoughts, and attains to and abides in the first meditative absorption, or jhana, which is detachment born and accompanied by applied thought, sustained thought, joy, and bliss." Now, just bear with me as I finish his description of the other 3 absorptions. And the second one he describes this way: by allaying applied and sustained thought, he attains to and abides in the second jhana or absorption, which is inner tranquility, unification of the mind, devoid of applied and sustained thought, joy and bliss. It has still joy and bliss. The third, by detachment from joy, he dwells in equanimity, mindful with clear comprehension, and enjoys bliss in the body, and attains to and abides in the third jhana, which the noble ones call dwelling in equanimity, mindfulness, and bliss. And then finally, the 4th absorption, by giving up of bliss and suffering, by the disappearance already of joy and sorrow, he attains to and abides in the 4th absorption, or jhana, which is neither suffering nor bliss, which is the purity of equanimity mindfulness. This is right concentration. Now, we're going to have to click on all 4 of those boxes, but before we do, let me just mention 2 things that seem to apply to all 4 levels or states of right concentration in that teaching of the Buddha from that sutta. First, the word jhana itself. This word is used to refer to all 4 levels or stages of concentration. So samadhi is made up of 4 states or levels of jhana, absorption. It could imply, when we use that word absorption or concentration, deep levels of mental concentration, as when we say, oh, she missed all my calls because she was so absorbed in her painting. Remember the analogy of the cat hunting the mouse as well. That's absorption, being absorbed in something mentally. And second, though, something that applies to all 4 of these, there's the repetition of the phrase to attain and then abide in the 4 different levels or states. To attain and abide in, ultimately, right concentration. In other words, the aim is not simply to attain to these dimensions of concentration, but to so cultivate them as to abide in them as a normal way of being, which reveals, I think, an important point. When I began to study the Dhamma of the Buddha and to shape my meditation practices around it, I assumed that concentration here meant something like sitting alone, silent, eyes closed, mentally focused in contemplation. I assumed that this was the kind of concentration that's being required and that it would take a lot of mental effort. And that's not wrong, but it's not the whole story either. What I've come to learn is that while the practice of that sort of mental focus is indeed an element of Buddhist meditation, it's not an end in and of itself. It is a practice, remember, that we engage in so as to get ourselves ready for something else. That's what a practice is. When I was a swimmer, swim practice wasn't the point. The miles we swam in our practices were getting us ready for something else, competitions. In this case, the practices requiring concentration are practices designed to enable us to attain right concentration, not just in those moments of intense, mindful practice, but as a way of being all the time, in daily interactions and the course of events, both trivial and important, not just in intense periods of seclusion and withdrawal and silence. Putting these things together, jhana as absorption, and the aim of cultivating a unified mind as a unified way of being, enables us to summarize right concentration as the state or stage in which we are so unified in mind and awareness that not only in times and periods of intense focused practices, but in the moment-to-moment flow of everyday lives and conversations and experiences, we experience that. All right, so what about these 4 levels? Think of them as stages one experiences and works through on the way to a more complete experience of right concentration and the unification of our mind, and ultimately the culmination and bringing together and completion of the Dhamma itself. The first jhana. And as a reminder, here it is again in the Buddha's own words. What is right concentration? Herein, a monk is aloof from sense desires, aloof from unwholesome thoughts, attains to and abides in the first meditative absorption, or jhana, which is detachment born, accompanied by applied thought, sustained thought, joy, and bliss. So let me try to unpack this. The first of the absorptions is characterized by a physical and mental separation from 2 things, which should sound very familiar from earlier episodes: the desires that are associated with our 6 senses, and the unwholesome thoughts associated with the 3 poisons of craving, anger, and illusion. The first absorption is grounded in a seclusion or separation from craving and attachments. It's marked by applied thought and sustained attention, the directing of the mind, the energy that requires, with the intention of maintaining focus. The Buddha indicates that such mental absorption is typically accompanied by a sense of joy and elation. And I think of it a little bit like a runner's high when the endorphins kick in. So in this first jhana, the cultivation of a unified mind, a single-pointed attentiveness, is accompanied by 4 ingredients: applied mental focus, sustained mental focus, and an accompaniment of a joy and elation that is, as I said, akin to a sort of psychic endorphin rush. Before moving to the second jhana, it's important to ask in this first jhana, what is it that the mind is directed towards? And to what does it give sustained attention? Now, there's a lot of practices in Buddhist instruction aimed at helping us enter or begin this kind of concentration. These typically center on fairly simple points of focus, such as breathing practices, simply paying attention to the flow of our breath, or the body scan that I've introduced a couple of different times, or selecting an image, a circle, or something to look at, or even just visualize. In other words, these are practices not aimed at discursive meditation, not aimed at thinking about stuff, this or that, but aimed at bringing stillness to such mental activity, to stop thinking about things by focusing on hunting the mouse. But note, sustained direction of the mind in such practices is just an entry point. It's not a destination. And this becomes clear in the second of the 4 jhanas. And here again are the Buddhist words about it. By allaying or setting aside applied and sustained thought, notice that gets set aside now, the practitioner abides in the second jhana, which is inner tranquility, unification of the mind, devoid of applied and sustained thought. And still present are the endorphin elements of joy and bliss. In this second stage of concentration, one sets aside or moves beyond the applied, sustained thought that are the ingredients of that first one. It's a singleness of mind that has not only left off discursive mental activity, thinking about this or that, but has also ceased active effort to pay attention to any focus of our practice in the first jhana, such as breathing, or the body, or a visual object that has been the center of our mental effort. What remains is a still, quiet sense of joy and elation, even pleasure that comes born of such concentration. Buddhist teachers speak of the mind settling into stillness and settling into a profound calm. In the third jhana, the Buddha describes this way. Let's start with his description. By then detachment now from that joy we've been describing, the practitioner dwells in equanimity, mindful, with clear comprehension, enjoying bliss in the body, and attains to and abides in the third jhana, the noble ones call dwelling in equanimity, mindfulness, and bliss. There's still a sense of what the Buddha calls elation or bliss, but the joy referred to above is now transcended. The difference between the joy and the elation aren't really mentioned or elaborated here. It seems to be that joy can still contain a subtle agitation, perhaps, like a fluctuation which can draw our attention away. It can come and go. That feeling of joy is no longer experienced in this level. And the elation that remains is accompanied by a deeper sense of equanimity, that quality which enables one to be untouched by, as an example in this case, the absence of the joy that we experienced in the prior two levels. As a result, the level of stillness and calm and steadiness is even deeper at this stage. Now, in all transparency here, because I have not attained this stage in any sort of abiding or continuing way, though I've experienced brief glimpses, I just want to say that. I'm relying a lot on what I've learned from other Buddhists as they describe the state. So, as I'm sure may be the case for my listeners, I still have questions myself about the subtle differences between the second and third jhana and the difference between joy and elation, for example. So with that caveat, let me go on to the fourth and final of the jhanas, which the Buddha describes like this. By giving up a bliss, now that one's gone too, and suffering, or any awareness of that or of the absence of those things, by the disappearance already of joy and sorrow at the lack of joy, he attains to and abides in the fourth jhana, which is neither suffering nor bliss, which is pure equanimity, what he refers to as equanimity mindfulness. That is right concentration. In addition to having left behind focused thought and the effort to pay attention, here in this level of absorption, there's no experience of joy or elation. Neither is there a sense of their absence. There is no sense of suffering. This is what is meant by the purity of equanimity. So what then is left? Well, what's left is a single-pointed, attentive awareness, a fully unified mind, bare awareness, the awareness sometimes of being aware, sometimes not even of that. At this stage, and here the Buddha is speaking from experience, the Buddha says that the mind becomes completely pure, resting in a razor-sharp mindfulness, an absolute, untarnished equanimity, which is a deep, calm sense of well-being. Now, how? How does one get there? And again, I'm not claiming that I fully understand all of that. I'm simply trying to express as best I can what the Buddha said and what I have gleaned from other practitioners and teachers. But anyway, how does this happen? Hearing about these levels of right concentration and coming to understand in theory what they mean is one thing. How does one put it into practice? I mean, after all, the whole point, again, for the Buddha is practice. He's not teaching these things merely to give us information, but to guide us in what we might call transformation. There are a lot of practices we could list here, as I've mentioned before, but I'm briefly going to describe two that might serve as examples. And please consult other Buddhist teachers and guides along the way for more help with this. One type of practice is to cultivate a focus on the body, and we've looked at that before. For example, paying attention to the flow of breath passing through the nostrils, as we've mentioned before. A second example is the use of an actual imagined object, which again, I have mentioned before, which we look at or visualize without using the mind to think about or analyze. In both examples, the point is to engage the mind in a way that frees it from the normal ebb and flow and agitation and random chaos of thinking, of wondering, of questioning, freeing it, and thus also freeing us to just be. And while this does require effort to cultivate the habit and the practice, I think it's important to add a reminder from Buddhist teachers who've made progress in all this, that yes, while exerting effort is a factor, when we struggle to make progress, the solution is not necessarily to just double down on the intensity of the effort. Sometimes the solution is simply to relax and relinquish the points of resistance that we're discovering. Why is this a struggle? And then letting go of those. As we learn to simply observe the presence of, say, anxiousness or fear or self-doubt or boredom or discouragement, rather than struggling to overcome them or push through or engage them in battle, so to speak, we allow the mind to grow quiet, to settle into deeper levels of calm, to observe that these things are there, but not to engage. Well, we've looked at what right concentration is, and 2 examples for beginning, at least, to know how to begin to practice it. But let me come back to the question of why. I'm coming to the end of the Buddha episodes here, and we've explored all the major themes of his teaching, and drawing from the very beginning, we've gone back to his own story and the first discourse he delivered. Our journey opened up the Russian stacking dolls of his Dhamma, all the drop-down menus of his teaching, as one by one we examined the 4 noble truths and the Eightfold Path. This morning, as I was doing my own meditation and beginning to imagine working on this episode and bringing it to a conclusion, a question came to me. Okay, but why bother? Why pursue all this? What's the point? And one obvious answer is, of course, found in the 4 noble truths themselves. It's to end the suffering that is generated by craving. And as we've seen, the Mahayana Buddhist approach adds another element to this, without dismissing that first one, of course. Why pursue this path? To cultivate an all-encompassing compassion for everything, everyone, all beings, sometimes referred to as cultivating the Buddha mind. And one way that the qualities and characteristics of of this kind of compassion are described is through the lens of the 4 Brahmaviharas, which we've looked at in prior episodes. Compassion, empathy, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. To cultivate these, and to, in a sense, become these, and then, in a very real sense, also to exude or extend these, becomes the unifying motivation, the foundational root answer in Mahayana Buddhism to the question, why do this? Well, at least that is more and more becoming my answer. Well, what's next? In episode 18, I explained that one reason I'm drawn to that Mahayana approach to compassion as the ultimate why has to do with the influence of the Gospel of John, which I looked at in earlier episodes of the podcast. I see an affinity between the concept of the Buddha mind as this all-encompassing compassion and the vision of the divine nature as I find that described in the opening verses of the Gospel of John, which, again, was the focus of earlier episodes in the podcast. I'm not saying they're the same thing, and I'm not saying that the Gospel of John and the Buddha would see everything the same way or agree on everything and kind of look at each other and say, oh, I see, we're just using different words. But both have shaped me in profound ways, and I want to listen in on whatever conversation they might have. I want to see what they would talk about and what they would ask each other. And I think it's time for these 2 friends of mine, then, to come over to my place and meet up. So I plan to invite them to do just that and to meet together with me. And I invite you to join me in that conversation and listen in along with me next time.